Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things, and today I'm going to be talking about my favourite Victorian authors. So I did a video, I think 2 years ago, counting down my top favourite Victorian novels, and then last year I did a video counting down through all the 100 Victorian novels I've read, from my least favourite to my favourite. But I realised I've never made a video talking about my favourite Victorian authors. My favourite Victorian novels lists are both slightly out of date. I will make another favourite Victorian novels video at some point, maybe next Victober, but I feel like it hasn't changed enough for it to be worth me making one yet. But I thought instead I would make a video about my favourite Victorian authors. So I have 6 authors to talk to you about today, my 5 favourite Victorian authors, and a kind of honourable mention slash an author who I think will probably become one of my favourite authors. So I thought I would go through these authors from sort of number 6 to number 1, and for each of them I would tell you a bit about why I like them as an author, and then recommend my favourite novel by them, and also a good place to start with their work if I feel like that is a different book to the book that is my favourite, if that makes sense. You may notice the absence of some authors on this list who you might expect to find on this list. For example, thinking of Emily Bronte, because Wuthering Heights is in my top 5 favourite novels ever, and I love it a lot, but I find it really hard to consider Emily Bronte a favourite author because she only wrote one book, and while I like her poetry a bit, I don't adore her poetry. And while I love Wuthering Heights hugely as a novel, I love it as a book rather than loving Emily Bronte as an author. I mean, obviously she wrote the book, but I don't know if that makes any sense. We'll go straight into the books. Number 6 on this list, my honourable mention is George Gissing. Now, George Gissing is an honourable mention rather than counted as one of my favourite Victorian authors because I've only read 3 of his books, and he wrote 23. And while I have absolutely loved the 3 of his books that I've read, I feel like I can't really class him as one of my favourite Victorian authors until I have read a little bit more through the body of his work. The rest of the 5 authors who are my top 5, for 4 of them I have read all of their novels and quite a lot of the rest of their shorter works and so on. And one of them I've read more than 10 books, so I feel like I can say they're one of my favourite authors. Whereas George Gissing, I feel like I just haven't read enough yet to make that judgment. However, I love George Gissing a lot. He is an absolutely brilliant writer. He is quite dark and quite bleak and quite gritty. I think if you like Thomas Hardy, you will like George Gissing because he is quite similar in terms of looking at tragic situations and the ways in which people can get so close to being happy and not quite succeed, and looking at dysfunctional families and the big issues of late Victorian society and how social pressures can really crack families apart and really ruin people's lives, the pressures of class and gender and so many other things. He's such a fascinating writer. In many ways I consider George Gissing like the urban Hardy. Like Hardy, he tends to write about the working classes. Like Hardy, he deals with a lot of tragic and difficult situations. But like Hardy, his writing is beautiful, his characters are realistic and fully formed, and there are amazing seeds of beautiful love stories, even if they don't always have happy endings. As I said, I have read 3 of his novels, The Netherworld, New Grub Street and The Odd Woman. I read them in that order. My favourite of his novels is definitely The Odd Woman, which I absolutely loved. The Odd Woman is a very feminist novel, which is one of the reasons amongst many why I love it. The title The Odd Women doesn't mean strange women, it means odd as in left out, not part of a pair. It refers to the fact that in late Victorian Britain there were a lot more women than men, which meant even more women than before were single. And basically this book looks at what single women did in the 19th century, having been brought up to be told that their purpose in life was to get married and have children. What do you do if that's not what you're doing with your life? And it looks at women finding work and finding other happiness in life, and looks at a group of sisters and various other associated women. It's an absolutely incredible book. This is my favourite one, as I said. It's also, I think, what I would recommend starting with George Gissing, although it's not where I started. I think because although it's not a happy book, it's still pretty grim in a lot of places. But because it is so impassioned about female empowerment and emancipation, I suppose, that makes it a really exciting and joyful read at times as well. So although it's still quite dark, it's not quite as grim as The Netherworld and New Grub Street. So yeah, would definitely recommend this and would definitely recommend George Gissing. At number 5, or maybe at number 4, these 2 next authors are joint 4th and 5th, and I'm trying to work out whether the one I have placed at number 4 I've just placed there because they wrote more books. I don't know. Anyway, well, it just doesn't matter. Still both 2 of my favourite authors. At number 5 is the amazing Charlotte Bronte, who I love a lot. Charlotte Bronte was the author who got me into Victorian literature when I read Jane Eyre as a teenager and just completely fell in love with it and with her writing. I love Charlotte Bronte a lot. I think she is a really, really brilliant writer, and I think she's very good at getting to the heart of her characters. I also think she draws very psychologically complex characters and deals quite a lot in her books with loneliness and depression, which I think is really, really interesting and really, really brilliantly done. And she also tells brilliant and often surprising love stories often concerning people who are not conventionally attractive, which is not that common in the Victorian period and very refreshing. She also incorporates quite a lot of the Gothic into her work, which I think is really, really nice. I really like that blend of like a Gothic, vaguely sometimes supernatural hinting themes with like realistic, psychologically complex characters. So my favourite Charlotte Bronte novel is Villette, which I adore and I think is really like criminally underrated. It's such an amazing book. It's about a young woman, Lucy Snow, who goes abroad to Belgium to become a teacher and looks at her life and unrequited love and so many other things. It's just, oh, it's such a powerful, moving, amazing book and I love it. I really must reread it sometime. If you're someone that was a little bit disappointed by Jane Eyre in some ways, I would really recommend reading Villette because it does something slightly different in a way that's really, really good. That is my favourite Charlotte Bronte novel, but the place I would recommend starting with Charlotte Bronte is Jane Eyre. I think there is a reason why it has become so famous. It is so readable, so engaging, sucks you right in from the beginning, and, you know, this is the book that got me into Victorian literature when I was 13, and I think it's a brilliant, brilliant place to start, not just with Charlotte Bronte, but with Victorian literature, because it does suck you in, and you follow Jane from a child into her adulthood, and there's mysteries and love stories and so much going on in there, and Jane is such a compelling character and so relatable. I also think Jane Eyre is like a brilliant book for teenagers, which I feel like I've said that before. I mean, quite a lot of 19th century literature is actually, because a lot of the heroes and heroines, especially heroines of 19th century literature, are people in their late teens, and actually I do think, like, as a teenager I found it really, really helpful, especially reading about someone like Jane Eyre who has so many like issues with confidence and things like that, but also at the same time as not thinking very much of herself, also like declares her right to happiness, and it's great, it's so good. So that's where I'd recommend starting with Charlotte Bronte, but also Villette. If you've read Jane Eyre, Villette is awesome. At number 4 / maybe at number 5, having just raved about Charlotte Bronte, I feel like maybe he belongs at number 5, but at number 4 / number 5 is Thomas Hardy, who I do love a lot. Thomas Hardy is a brilliant, brilliant novelist. There are so many things I love about his work. A lot of people say that what they love about Hardy is the way he writes about landscape and nature. I am not too fussed about the way he writes about landscape and nature. Don't get me wrong, it's very beautiful, but I've never been that interested in like depictions of landscape. There's just not something in books that really appeals to me. But the way that he writes about how landscape affects people, that's what I'm into in Hardy. And also the way that he writes about how sort of Victorian society affects people, how the kind of pressures of class and expectations, the constrained nature of Victorian marriage and the way Victorian thinks about kind of sex and morality. Like, it's so, so interesting. He deals with so many important themes in his books. He wrote a lot of books, 14, and I love nearly all of them. They're a brilliant range of books dealing with so many amazing themes. And there's something about some Hardy books which I find really hard to describe. It's not all of them, but some Hardy books just have this epic, tragic, amazing quality that just makes them like so emotionally powerful. It's really hard to explain what I mean, but he's just got that Hardy-esque thing, which is great. As I mentioned earlier with Gissing, Thomas Hardy can be quite dark, but he's also a really, really brilliant writer of amazing characters and brilliant love stories, and even if not all the books have a happy ending, I do think they're all kind of superbly written and really, really fascinating to read, and he's certainly an author I would recommend. My favourite Thomas Hardy is Jude the Obscure, which I absolutely love. It's about a man called Jude who, early in life, kind of marries the wrong person and kind of everything that goes on from there, and what happens when he then does meet the person who perhaps he would have been happier had he married, and things kind of go on from there. It's also about Jude's struggle to be educated. He's born in a kind of working class background, but he early on in life discovers that he loves Latin and he loves reading and he loves literature and education, but he can't go to Oxford because he doesn't have any money and he's a stonemason, and it kind of looks at his struggles with his class. It's an absolutely incredible book and one I love, but I would not recommend it as a place to start with Hardy because it is perhaps the grimmest of all his books, and it's pretty miserable, but it's really, really great. So where I would recommend starting with Thomas Hardy is Far from the Madding Crowd, which is a brilliant, brilliant book about a woman called Bathsheba who inherits a farm, and about her running that farm, and about all the men who kind of slightly flock around her. There is dark stuff in Far from the Madding Crowd, but in general it's not quite so heavy as Jude the Obscure. A way to slightly easy win to the tragic nature of reading Thomas Hardy. It's a brilliant, brilliant novel and one I really, really like. Bathsheba is such a compelling character, and yeah, I would definitely recommend both of these. At number 3, my third favourite Victorian author has got to be Anthony Trollope. I love Anthony Trollope a lot. He is a brilliant, brilliant writer. So I have read 10 out of his 47 novels, so I have a long way to go, but I've absolutely loved every single one that I've read, and I think he is so, so talented. While I love the absurdity of Dickens, which I'll get onto in a bit, I love the realism of Trollope. For me, he is the Victorian writer who creates the most realistic characters. Like, I read Trollope and I'm like, yeah, I can imagine all these people. I feel like they're all real. And I think he does that so brilliantly, especially considering he wrote so many books, many of which have such vast casts of characters. I love the way he looks at themes of religion and marriage and class and social difference and friendship and money and respectability and so many other things. He is such a brilliant writer. I also think he is one of those writers that writes brilliantly about people who've married the wrong people. Quite often, people who have married people who they're not really that suited to, but they kind of have to get on with it anyway. I think that's a theme in quite a few of his books, which I think is really, really well done. I think he's such a fantastic author and definitely one I would recommend. He also, as well as many standalone novels, wrote two separate series of interconnecting novels, the Barsetshire Chronicles and the Palliser novels, which also do have some like overlapping characters between them. And I love that like self-contained little world. I guess a little bit like Hardy's Wessex, but not just with places, with characters. That's something that I love about the way that Anthony Trollope has like crafted a whole county or a whole like system, a whole new Victorian world in which all the characters mingle. It's just so rewarding. My two favourite Anthony Trollope books are The Small House at Allington and The Way We Live Now, and I can't pick between them. I love them both so much for very different reasons. This is a book about a man called Melmotte who turns up in London with a lot of money and no one really knows where he's got it from, and everybody decides that they would like to hang out with him because he has a lot of money. And this is about two sisters who live in the small house at Allington near the big house. They don't have very much money, and it's about their kind of relationships with men in a kind of Sense and Sensibility-esque way, but better. However, I always find it really hard to know where to start with Anthony Trollope when people ask me. I have a feeling there is a perfect novel to start on Anthony Trollope, and I haven't read it yet. But for now, the place I started with Anthony Trollope was either The Way We Live Now, or I think more likely was He Knew He Was Right, which is another really, really brilliant Anthony Trollope novel, which looks at a couple who get married, and soon after they get married, the husband begins to kind of grow increasingly jealous, and it kind of looks at the effect that has on their married life. The Way We Live Now and He Knew He Was Right are brilliant books, really good places to start with Anthony Trollope, except that they're both humongous. Like, He Knew He Was Right is the size of this as well. So if you would like to start with a slightly shorter Anthony Trollope, I might recommend Rachel Ray, which is a really great love story and a really enjoyable read and rather a lot shorter. Or you might want to start with the Barsetshire Chronicles. The Small House Allington is the 5th book in the Barsetshire Chronicles, by the way, which is why I'm definitely not recommending you start there, because I really strongly recommend that you read the Barsetshire Chronicles in order. The first two books are The Warden and Barsetshire Towers. The Warden is very, very short. However, it is a lot about church politics. So if you think you might find it a little bit dry, what I would recommend doing is reading The Warden and Barsetshire Towers back to back, and that's a really good place to start with Trollope because they link very closely together, and if you treat them effectively as if they're one book, read them back to back, I think that will firmly get you into Trollope. So anyway, next author. My second favourite Victorian author, and my second favourite author of all time, probably, I think she does just about most of the time beat Jane Austen, is Elizabeth Gaskell, who I think is absolutely incredible. She's a brilliant, brilliant writer and really, really varied. As well as her main novel, she also wrote a lot of short stories, and across her books she writes gothic fiction and industrial novels and novels set in the rural Midlands. She writes beautiful love stories and books about murder, and like such a range. She's such a brilliant, multifaceted, talented author, and I absolutely, absolutely cannot recommend her work enough. I love her writing style. I find it like so warm and engaging and interesting and so funny at times, and I think she, I guess maybe as much as Trollope, she creates really fully fledged realistic characters that you really do believe in. I love the way as well she looks at what it's like to be a kind of young woman in Victorian society growing up and the kind of pressures on you. I think she examines families absolutely brilliantly, the relationships between parents and children and siblings so well. She also writes wonderfully about religion and morality and changes in viewpoints about industrialisation and strikes and workers and the difficulties of working classes in cities in the 19th century. Like, she's such a talented author, and I just love her so much. I just think she's absolutely, absolutely brilliant. So my favourite Elizabeth Gaskell novel is North and South, and that is also the place I would recommend starting with Elizabeth Gaskell, although I think you could also very happily start with Wives and Daughters too. North and South follows a young woman called Margaret who must be, I think, 18 or 19 years old when her father gives up his job as a minister because he has doubts about the Anglican Church, and he becomes a kind of dissenter minister and teacher, and he uproots his wife and his daughter from their home in the south to the industrial town of Milton, which is it's basically Manchester. I like to fondly refer to this as Pride and Prejudice and Industrialisation, or Pride and Prejudice with Mills, because it is, in some aspects of it, fairly Pride and Prejudice-esque, but also like looks at strikes and the pressures of industrialisation in mid-19th century northern towns. So yes, would definitely recommend this. I would definitely recommend Elizabeth Gaskell. But my number one favourite Victorian author, as I'm sure a lot of you already know, is of course the amazing Charles Dickens. I love Dickens a lot. I discovered his work when I was 14 years old. I just completely fell in love with his writing. He does such interesting and weird things with language. He is in some ways an absurdist writer, especially in his use of similes, where sometimes you're just like, what are you talking about, Dickens? But I love it, I love it. It feels like all the words just tumbled out of his brain and somehow made like a perfect, amazing, brilliant thing. I also think he is like a master storyteller. Like there are many great novelists of like interesting themes, and obviously Dickens has brilliant themes, but he also he can tell a damn good story. Like his books are so plot driven, he does tell such good love stories, such great crime mysteries. Like his books are just full of twists and turns and you never know what's going to happen next, and I absolutely love that. I mean, I do now know what's going to happen next because I've read them all, but you know, I still feel like I don't because they're that compelling. I also think he has great characterization and makes use of kind of exaggerated characters which are in some way familiar to realistic characters. So he has these characters which are really extreme, but also you know people that have just like a little bit of that character in them. I also really love the balance between like light and dark in his work, and the fact that like although he deals with very dark themes, he also has a lot of like light relief and comedy and a lot of like real happiness and joy and beautiful love stories and all of that kind of stuff along with the dark themes, and I really love that. I mean, I could go on for a really long time about why I love Charles Dickens because there are a lot of reasons. My favourite Charles Dickens novel is Our Mutual Friend, which I absolutely love. It tells the story of a fortune left behind by a man who made his money in rubbish. It's due to go to his son, but on the way back from abroad, the son is found murdered. And everything kind of goes on from there, and it's about what happens to the money and all the people who are connected via that money, and it's great. I love it. I love it. However, it's not necessarily the best place to start with Charles Dickens. Obviously it's one of his longer ones, and also it's got a lot of plots. Like, I mean, like a good kind of 15 subplots going on. If you are new to Dickens, what I would recommend is either starting with something like The Christmas Carol, which is a bit shorter and contained and really lovely, and you probably have a vague idea of the story already, or picking up one of his novels that are in the first person, so Great Expectations or David Copperfield. David Copperfield is a bit longer, but it's still really engaging. I do think because Dickens' writing is a little bit unusual and it takes a little bit of time to get used to his writing, I think it's worth starting with one of his first-person narratives, because it means you don't have to worry about remembering who all the characters are. You have one central character that you can like remember and you know who they are and you follow them about, and that makes it just much easier to get into his work, I think. So I would recommend starting with Great Expectations or David Copperfield. Great Expectations especially, I suppose, because it's shorter and also brilliant, but so is this, and also The Christmas Carol, and also everything he wrote. I feel like that has been more than enough talk about my favourite Victorian authors for now. Thank you very much for watching. Please let me know down in the comments who your favourite Victorian authors are, and I'll be back very soon with another Victober video.